innovation and cutting-edge manufacturing, among other sectors. We believe it will be impossible to meet global goals and challenges without the full and enthusiastic participation of countries from Latin America, North America, and the Caribbean. Yet, despite an abundant endowment of highly sought natural resources, our shared region is frequently and unfortunately overlooked in the global conversation. It's time for that to change. Today, we seek to understand the nature of the issues facing the region while identifying best practices in the supply of critical materials for broad-based regional economic and social development. To discuss these important issues, prior to a terrific senior-level public and private sectors panel, we are privileged to have with us the Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment of the U.S. Department of State, the Honorable Jose Fernandez. Jose leads these efforts on behalf of the State Department, and he has been instrumental in advancing economic and environmental partnerships across the region. His biography, for those who are interested, is linked in the Zoom chat. Mr. Undersecretary, welcome back to the Council of the Americas.
Thank you for having me, Eric. This place is home. Delighted to be here.
Well, you're welcome at any time.
Thank you.
Give us a sense of your priorities leading these efforts on behalf of the State Department, and how do you seek to accomplish your goals?
Eric, critical minerals is a top priority at the State Department. It's a top priority for my team at the State Department. We've got a need, and that need goes beyond Latin America. That need is very simple. We need to, by 2030, experts tell us that we need to increase our supply of critical minerals by 3.5 times in order to start working on our clean energy goals. It's an exponential number for some other minerals. Lithium, by 2050, if we are going to reach our clean energy goals, we need to have 42 times the amount of lithium we have today, 25 times manganese. That is a vulnerability. That's a need. We are not going to get to where we want to go in the clean energy space without the increase of those critical minerals. Latin America is a major piece of that. And something that we've done and at the State Department that I'm really delighted to have led is the Mineral Security Partnership. The Mineral Security Partnership is composed of 14 countries plus the European Union to work on a number of items. First, sharing information. We weren't getting the information from the region on what critical mineral projects existed. Work on financing, share financing opportunities, share investment opportunities, work on recycling. Recycling right now is a minimal aspect of critical minerals, but experts tell us that in 20 to 15 years, we'll have as much as 20% of the batteries in your electric vehicles will come from recycled materials. And then the last thing, and this is our calling card, is we're going to do this while adhering to the highest environmental, social, and governance standards. In order to do this, we realize that extraction mining can be a sensitive topic in many places. And as you know, in Latin America, that's a major issue. And we're going to do things right. We're going to make sure that companies that operate in the region follow the standards that they would follow at home. So though it's a major, critical minerals is one of our major initiatives at State. And I'm delighted to tell you that we're having good success. Mm-hmm. So that's why I'm delighted to be here.
Impressive statistics that you just gave in terms of the need for these materials going forward. Were those U.S. needs or global needs?
Global needs, which is why in the Mineral Security Partnership, when I first went to some of our partners, the Koreans, the Japanese, and others, they were thinking the same thing. We were pushing an open door in the creation of this. Everyone is concerned about the need for these minerals. They realize that we can't get to where we want to go without some sort of change in our supply.
And yet, when you talk about critical materials, critical minerals in international fora, people generally talk about other parts of the world. Latin America is oftentimes overlooked. How can we change that dynamic? How can we get the region more as a central part of the conversation in these types of conversations that are happening globally?
Well, that perspective is changing.
Yeah.
I think people are starting to realize that the region has the most abundant resources on critical minerals. Just to give you a couple of factoids, 60% of known reserves of world reserves are in Latin America today. 60 of lithium, 40% of copper. As you know, Chile is a major producer. So is Peru. So are a number of others. Panama has a major mine as well. So the resources, the critical mineral resources in the region are unmatched. You're right that they have not received as much attention as they should have. This is also, I think, and they realize that this is a generational opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is something that happens once every 25 years. The opportunity is here, and they realize that they need to take advantage of it. And that's, I think, you have a really a marriage of convenience and opportunity, in that the need is there, and Latin America is well poised to take advantage of it.
So let me follow up on what you just said, because I think that's an absolutely critical point. The region has a massive opportunity. The world has a need. Is the region fully aware of that, and not just at a intellectual level, but are they taking steps to attract the sort of investment that's required to develop those resources? And what perhaps are you and the department doing to work with some of the regional governments to help draw that investment, that high quality investment you talked about?
That's part of my job.
Yeah.
They are aware. You've seen, as you know, Chile promulgate legislation on critical minerals. The government is on top of this. Bolivia, Peru, obviously Argentina. So that is well known to them. I think the challenge is just to make sure that the investment climate is the right investment climate. A critical minerals project, any mining project, will take anywhere from 5 to 10 years at best to come on stream from the moment that you start thinking about it. You can't just take out your investment. Once you're there, it's literally it's sunk cost. No,
Literally, yeah.
And so the issue of business climate, the issue of attracting the kinds of investments that you want, but also, and this is something that the State Department has been doing even before I got there. We have a number of capacity building programs and technical assistance programs where we're helping countries in Latin America, but also elsewhere, map their resources. There are many countries that you'd be amazed just don't know what they have. They say to us, "We need your help. We don't even know what kinds of tenders we ought to have. What we need from you is your help in mapping the resources. We need your help in how do we run a tender process in a way that's fair." And that capacity building, just to give you a couple of concrete examples, this week, we have a number of Argentine mining regulators in the US on capacity building. Yesterday, we had a critical minerals working group with Brazil. So it's not only extraction, it's not only looking for ways to actually mine the resources. It's also looking for ways to help countries become more confident in their ability to attract investment.
Mm-hmm. And is there a recognition, as State Department and other agencies of the U.S. government have said repeatedly, is there recognition across the region that all investment perhaps isn't the same? I mean, there is high quality investment and there's lower quality investment. And the reality is some of the investment that has come into the region is from authoritarian countries and perhaps doesn't share the same democratic values as many of the investors might from Western or other democratic societies. Is that a part of the conversation that you're having as well?
It is. But you've got to take a step back.
Yeah.
What countries tell us all the time is that they know that U.S. investment, European investment from our partners and allies is a high quality investment. They know that we're not going to engage in a race to the bottom. They know that we are going to work with communities, that we're going to, we can't just simply by virtue of our laws, we can't bribe government officials. We'll end up in jail as a result.
It's illegal.
It's illegal, and we'll make my lawyer brethren wealthier. But You just can't do it. So they won't, and also our stockholders, the stockholders of these companies will not allow that.
Yeah.
But what they tell us is in Latin America and elsewhere is we need alternatives. You can't just come in here and say, don't do this. You've got to say, don't do this because this is better. And so what we're trying to do is to provide alternatives and to do it in a way that de-risks the investment for companies that want to go in there. We know that this is a hard investment to make for the reasons I know that you just can't pick up and leave. So what we're trying to do through the MSP is to work on providing alternatives and also to make sure that we convince countries that those alternatives will help not only the mining sector in these countries, but will also benefit communities. Something I have learned in this business is the amount of work and the amount of effort that many of our companies are putting on making sure that communities are consulted, that communities benefit, because as you know, in Latin America, there are projects right now that are viable projects, but are projects that simply aren't going anywhere because communities are blocking the roads.
Yep.
They're not letting them. And that's something that companies now realize is part of the cost of doing business. You've got to engage. And I'm not in Latin America, but I just came from Mongolia, where 25% of the Mongolian GDP comes from one mine, one copper mine. The company has built parks, has built water systems. And I ask them, well, isn't this expensive? And they say, well, it's like hiring consultants. It's part of what we need to do if we are going to be successful.
So in the short time we have remaining, because I know your time is tight, but I want to expand on that point just a bit, because I think this is the critical point that you've just raised, and really appreciate you doing so. Mining, extractives, critical materials, what have you, has a long history in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere, and it isn't always favorable. How do we work together with the countries in the region to ensure that the benefits really are widely shared? And yes, there is corporate social responsibility, as you've just referred to. There are company activities that happen routinely at this point from most major Western investors, et cetera. But are there things that can be done to encourage the governments on the ground? Because at the end of the day, these are sovereign countries. They're not subject to the United States or US law. Right. And yet the projects that might be invested in, are targets for communities, and local governments sometimes aren't engaged in the way that one would hope that they might be. How can we change that dynamic to ensure that everybody wins here?
Well, we have to do that for the reasons I noted. And through the Mineral Security Partnership, one of the first things we did is we actually, there was a fair amount of cynicism, Eric, when you talk about ESG principles, and they say, well, you're just talking, you're not really walking the talk. Well, the first thing we did is I went at the beginning of the year, I went to Cape Town to the African Mining Conference, the annual mining conference called Mining Indaba. A couple of weeks before that, the Pope had been in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and you may remember he talked about how the West had raped and pillaged African resources. And I talked about that. And not only that, what we've done is we have put together and we have published so that people can hold us to our standards, a 6-page description of what we mean by ESG and what we will insist that our companies get involved in. And as we're now looking at, we've had about 200 projects in the Mineral Security Partnership that have been proposed to us. We've chosen 15. And why have we not chosen the other 185? A lot of them just don't meet our ESG standards. So it's not a perfect, it's not, obviously there will be some mistakes along the way, but this is something that unless we get it right, then we will lose what I think is our competitive advantage. This is what countries want. But we've got to convince them that we actually can provide it. And we've got to get over the fact that, as you well noted, the history of mining in many countries is checkered.
Mm-hmm. And final question, is that something that message is being received well in the region, is being incorporated, or again, the cynicism, I mean, it's real, based on 500-600 years of history?
Well, we're getting there. We've got to get our private sector much more attuned to the opportunities, but the countries, as I mentioned, we have working groups with Brazil, Argentina, Chile. We've done work elsewhere. There's an interest. Again, countries realize that this is an opportunity. They just want to do it right, and they don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past.
What a terrific conversation. I wish we had more time. Hope you'll come back. You've launched this program spectacularly well, Mr. Undersecretary. Thank you for joining us, and hope to continue the conversation with you in the weeks and months ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll be going to our panel discussion, and we have a fabulous panel to discuss these issues in greater depth. Again, their biographic information will be available for you and is available for you in the Zoom chat. Jeff Gleeson is the British ambassador to Bolivia with previous stints in Bogota and London and several years as journalist. Juan Carlos Jobet is the former mining and energy minister of Chile, among other senior positions, and before that, he was an investment banker. Metallurgical engineer Marie-Pierre Paquin is chief advisor in the office of the chief scientist for Rio Tinto. Carlos Ibargüen is a consultant on energy policy and regulation after years in the oil and gas sector and also Bolivian government. And Christopher Smith is chief government affairs officer with Ford, previously serving as the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Energy. We have a hybrid program today. We have several people in the studio, as we just had the interview with the Undersecretary, and now we're going to go to several folks who are with us virtually from countries around the Western Hemisphere. We're going to start with Ambassador Gleeson. Jeff, welcome to the Council virtually from Bolivia, I believe you are right now. But let's begin with you. Critical materials competition is strong and it's getting more intense. What are governments such as the United Kingdom and others doing to ensure that Latin America is viewed in a new and favorable way in global energy transition?
Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to be with you and such an illustrious panel. Look, I think what we're trying to do across the region, and specifically in my patch, is much of what Jose mentioned in his first intervention is to think of how you form partnerships of mutual benefit between our countries. And in Bolivia, what we have organized with the Bolivian government and the state-owned lithium company is an academic partnership, because I think our USP in this region is the value added that we can bring. So in our case, we have a very comprehensive academic partnership with Warwick University, who are experts in battery technology. We have 10 master's degrees that we're funding with Warwick. We're doing a joint research project. And I think that's our competitive advantage, because what we don't have very much of is state-owned companies that can underwrite political or economic risk of doing business here. So I think what we have to do is form public-private partnerships between our own countries, our private sector, build the demand side in our countries. In the UK, we're very excited that Tata have just announced a £4 billion investment in a new gigafactory in the UK. So as our demand side grows, we need partners across the world, and to form the supply chain resilience that is that Jose set out. So I think that we focus on exactly what he said, a mutually beneficial partnership that has real value added, that looks not just at extractive industries, but also what the domestic industries in countries like Bolivia and around the region are aspiring to do, particularly on battery technology.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I want to go now to Minister Jobet from Bolivia to Chile. Ambassador Gleekin mentioned that, in fact, these benefits have to be widely spread. That's also a message that we heard from Undersecretary Fernandez. Mr. Minister, from your perspective as former minister in Chile covering some of these issues, how do you see these particular issues and ensuring that the benefits of a mining sector are widely distributed across the region?
Well, good morning, Eric. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be in this panel. I think that is a great question. I think one of the biggest challenges we've had historically, if you look at copper, for example, we produce between 25 and 30% of the world's copper. We are by far the biggest copper producer in the world. And copper has been a big source of government tax revenue in the past. We just changed our tax law to increase the contribution of mining companies to the government through taxes. But as you said, not always those benefits come back or are invested by the state in local communities. So we end up in a situation in which private companies make a reasonable contribution to public money through taxes, but then the state is not efficient in spending or investing that money back in local communities. There is a fiscal policy angle of this. I mean, some people argue that it's not good to have private companies paying taxes to local governments because you then generate tension between different jurisdictions or regions, so that money should go to the central or the Treasury Department. And I see that argument, but then the challenge is how do we invest that money back to local communities? To prevent what we see today, which is that in many cases, communities that live next to mining operations get jobs, that's true, but then get most of the costs of mining operations, pollution, water scarcity, and other issues. And I think the way to address that is first to make sure the central government makes good investment in those communities. That's number one. But second, I think it's important to have transparent and well-thought processes in which local communities are engaged in the development of projects very early on, so that they give, at least they're part of a consultation process, or in some cases, maybe even give prior consent to those projects. And there are several challenges to do that well, but I think that is a way to go. And some people think that another way to do that is to make sure that the government supports local communities to allow them to have maybe equity participation in some of the projects that are developed in their territories. That is complicated as well, but if it's well thought, that could be another way to align incentives and to make sure that communities not only, tolerate projects, but then maybe like those projects if those are well designed and they feel they are part of the project themselves.
Yeah, that's a really important point. You go from tolerating projects to actually embracing them and seeing them as part of your own future. And I think that dynamic is critically important. Really outstanding interventions from both of you. Let's go from the southern part of the hemisphere to the northern part. Let's shift gears to Canada. And Marie-Pierre, let's bring you on. Canada is also a mining country. It's also had very long experience with these issues. Maybe some of the models have been a little bit different, particularly at the provincial level. But you're in the private sector, and you take a look at all these economies from the perspective of the investor. Give us a sense of, and building on the previous two interventions, give us a sense of what you and Rio Tinto might look for in the context of investment opportunities. What sort of structures do you tend to find attractive? What sort of models do you find beneficial in terms of not just promoting the economics of mining, which is critically important, but also the social development aspect?
Yes, absolutely. So thank you for having me today. There's a lot of angle we can take that on, but one of the key elements where we can derive value, and the mining industry has not always been like the most liked industry, and for good reasons. And we need to clean up our act and make sure that people can trust us in the long term, that we will hold up to our commitment. And a big part of it is to engage with the community very early on in those projects, making sure that we understand the community need, the community, what they can derive from the project. And it has to be more than just like the job, like the previous speaker talked about. It cannot only be like the job in the nearby community. It has to be more than that. It has to be economic development in the long term. It has to be what's going to happen when the mine comes to an end. Mine are all bound to come to an end at some point in time when the resources are exhausted. So how can we make sure that at the end of the mine, we thought of it ahead of time, the community is involved, there's a plan for the after mining time for that community. I would say the other point that we feel is very important is if we want to provide the minerals that are required for the energy transition and decarbonizing the world, we have to do that in a very good way, in a very ESG sensitive way, comprising all of the facets of the ESGs. And being able to power those projects with renewable energy is a big one. So the access, and Southern America is a great example of that, in the sense that the resource is there, not only the resource in the ground, but the resource for the sun and the wind potential there is great. Even geothermal potential is great there. So anything that can favor the development of that kind of project to be able to power those mining projects that are often remote, with renewable energy is a key element. So if we want to meet our target of decarbonization, this is a key element for us to look into before we can invest. So the potential has to be there, and the willingness of the country, of the region, of the stakeholder around that to develop those projects is key.
That's a really important point. I mean, it's not just pulling stuff out of the ground, but the mechanism, the way that you actually do that, right? In terms of utilization of clean energy in that process, that's a really important point. And I imagine you find that from economy to economy, countries do those sorts of things differently, no? And that's clearly something that companies take into account before they make the initial commitment to invest, no?
Absolutely, absolutely. So any kind of incentive to develop this like renewable energy infrastructure, which we feel will potentially be the bottleneck of the decarbonization, how fast can we build that infrastructure, is very key.
Yeah. Great comments. Thank you very much. And we're going to transition now to the studio, and we're going to bounce back and forth. For those of you who are watching on Zoom, it's going to be a bit like a tennis match with Wimbledon just having concluded. But we're going to come back now to in the studio. We're going to bring Carlos Ibargüen into the conversation. Carlos, you have long experience in these issues, and we've been talking a lot already about ESG and the quality of investment. All investment is not the same. The undersecretary was talking about high quality investment and Western investment. We didn't talk much about the profile of investment that is lower quality, but from your perspective, I wonder if you can give us a sense of, are governments in the region in Latin America doing enough to draw the high quality investment that we're talking about, or are many countries simply content to have investment and it doesn't matter where it's from, it's just money, and at the end of the day that's what they really want?
Thanks, Eric. I think it's a great question, and I think it's a very complex question to answer.
And somewhat unfair to you, so I apologize.
I love these difficult questions. I think we need to look at this in a very pragmatic and very realistic way. At the end of the day, and this may sound like motherhood and apple pie, we would all love to see rules of the game that are transparent, the sanctity of contracts respected, attractive and equitable terms and conditions, ESG principles embedded in the contracts, fast permitting processes. All of these things, I think, are absolutely key to get investment flowing and get projects up and running. Now, when you look at Latin America and you look at the mining sector, especially in those countries that are very rich in these resources, I think you're looking at a long game. I think you're looking at a game that is for very sophisticated people, for very sophisticated companies that really understand the complexities of what's going on. Expecting a radical change in many of these countries towards market favorable terms and conditions early on, I think is not realistic. So I think companies need to do, and governments like the US government, like the UK government, I think they really need to do a few things. I think they need to think about mitigation. So important to understand what the issues are, what the risks are, and what can be done to mitigate these issues. We talk about opportunities, but let's not forget about the risks and the importance of understanding how to mitigate these issues. A second point that I think is important to raise has to do with your value proposition. What value proposition can you put forth that is better than your competition? So how can you create value for these countries with their resources better than your competition? And in many cases, your competition is China. So compare the value proposition that China puts forth and yours, and establish where the differentiators are and where you can actually beat them in this race. You also need to look at this from the point of view of these governments and their interests in what they want to ultimately achieve. So I think that many of these countries are not looking at lithium, for example, as one of the saviors in terms of cleaning the world. They're looking at it as a conduit to develop their own economy, to reduce their own poverty. And how can you support these bigger objectives as opposed to looking at this from a global, maybe Western view? So looking at that from that point of view, I think is important. I would also say that you have to be prepared to work now in a world that is focused on nationalism, on populist policies, and understand how you can actually, if you want to compete there, how you can actually enter this marketplace and work in a world where the government is going to be the key driver behind this. So reforms are going after placing governments as the key driver. How can you work in that world, and how can you work with these governments? So the Undersecretary, I think, mentioned very important things. Collaboration, establishing relationships. Sometimes it's best to become first the advisor of choice and then transition into the partner of choice. So how can you establish yourself as the advisor of choice to policymakers? I'll stop there and maybe we can continue.
No, and you've touched on, we're going to come back to in terms of the models, state-led versus private sector-led, and country, and does it matter, and that sort of thing. But you've really given us a lot to chew on there, and I want to explore it further in the conversation. But we have one panelist yet to bring into the conversation. That's Chris Smith of Ford Motor. Lithium has come into the conversation already, and the reason why, as we all know, is because lithium is critical for battery storage. Ford has made a massive bet on EVs in terms of cars and trucks, and going into the next stage of cleaner energy utilization. How do you see the Western Hemisphere in the context of your overall supply chains and business strategic goals? And we're not looking at it from Western Hemisphere development. We're not looking at it from ESG in the context of these are nice things to do. We're looking at it from your business plan. How does it fit?
Right. Well, terrific question. And I'll bring a little bit of a different perspective as coming from the demand side of the equation. First of all, a great appreciation for the challenges that governments have. It's, for me, illustrative to hear the comments from our various panelists that are articulating the challenge of doing something new in this space. I spent some time in the Department of Energy when the United States was wrestling with the challenges and opportunities around shale gas, around hydraulic fracturing, around drilling horizontal laterals, and all of the regulatory and technical challenges and business model challenges around taking those new technologies, creating value, but doing it in a way in which we brought the right value to communities where these operations are occurring. There's a lot of commonality. So when I see the Undersecretary talking about the ways that the United States are engaging with countries throughout the region in these partnerships to make sure that we're transferring knowledge and capabilities in a way that's useful, that's very encouraging, because I know how hard that is for regulators. Ford's making an enormous change. We're a 120-year-old company, and we're undergoing more change in this short period of time than we've had in our previous career or life as a company. We talk about electrification coming, but electrification is here. We're making a $50 billion set of investments in batteries, in vehicle assembly, in vehicle design throughout the world. We're going from a run rate of around 60,000 electric vehicles per year right now to a run rate of 600,000 vehicles per year by the end of this year.
Wow.
For a run rate of 2 million vehicles per year, electric vehicles by the end of 2026. We're building plants in locations throughout the United States and throughout the world. So it's a big investment that's driven by consumers and customers. There's an enormous demand for all of the critical minerals that you need to build these batteries. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, graphite, extremely important. We need it all. And there's going to be a lot of interest in diversifying the supply of these critical minerals, not only for the extraction, but also for refining and for processing of the critical minerals. I just spent some time in Argentina and in Brazil, speaking with governments in both locations. So we are very interested in the steps that governments are taking to do a couple of things. First, create a stable environment for investment. So, can we understand what the rules of the road are? And that's been mentioned by a couple of panelists here today.
Yeah.
But also to understand the resource potential, which is a new space. Like there will be collaborations, I think, that help us to understand what the real resource potential looks like in different places. And we're encouraging governments everywhere to help articulate their own visions for how they expect those resources to be developed in their local jurisdiction. And that's going to be different in Canada than in Chile.
Yep.
But the thing I'll emphasize is that this is not whether or not this transition will happen. It's happening now. The push is today. It's current. And there's a real opportunity, we think, to collaborate with governments throughout Latin America for, I think, a really attractive source of critical minerals that are really going to augment the supply chain that's going to help this transition in transportation.
You mentioned technology transfer, and if the country, it's an issue that I want to expand to the broader panel as well. But since you mentioned it, let's start with you, Chris, if we can.
Right.
Are you seeing Latin America primarily as a play to get materials out and manufacture somewhere else, or are you working with local economies in terms of developing capacity in the local economies and building capacity there and helping folks move up the value-added chain? Again, it's it's a phenomenon we're all wrestling with, but how are you all seeing that?
Yeah, so it's gonna vary from place to place.
Yeah.
And this is part of the thing that we're endeavoring to understand with each individual government is what is your vision? Creating value out of this resource. I think that across the board, governments are going to be interested in ensuring that there's more than just extraction happening within their borders. Governments are being concerned with protecting the natural patrimony of the natural resources that belong to the people of the country, making sure that those extractions create value in ways that bring value to the entire country. But we're also endeavoring to understand, well, what are ways that we can partner in different ways in different regions to say, well, what sort of upgrading can you do? What sort of processing can happen in the country? What is the country's vision for a stable investment climate such that greater degrees of value add can occur within those boundaries? That's a partnership. That's something that we as we try to endeavor to understand what sorts of investment relationship we're going to have throughout the region. Having a vision from the government of how they're going to support, how they're going to push, what are the competitive advantages of those regions. We want to make sure we're doing the right, adding the right value in the right place, in a place where there's a true competitive advantage to add that value. But that's not easy to do also. And as governments, as we pose those questions to governments, I tell you, I get a very wide range of responses. Sometimes it's well thought out, sometimes it's less, but it's hard work to do. So that's truly the nature of the partnership we're trying to work through.
Yeah, and there's a lot of goodwill and hope, but at the end of the day, market realities also dominate. So you have to have a sense of capacity, and you have to have a sense of ability in the context of comparative advantage, et cetera. And I want to turn to Ambassador Gleekin with that in mind. You're there in Bolivia. Bolivia has long been a society where products have been extracted from, but not much value has been added in the economy itself. And I know that's been a struggle for many governments in the country. But one of the announcements that we saw recently was that the government of Bolivia is seeking to develop an EV, a domestically produced automobile in Bolivia. And I think this goes to the point of, or the question of trying to capture some of that upside that goes beyond natural source extraction. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit from your perspective as an ambassador. Is this just a conversation that obsesses some of us here in Washington and in think tanks in various places, or is this a realistic path forward for some of the countries in the region?
So I think it's a really good question, and it goes back to Eric's point that each country will have a different vision. In Bolivia, there's very much a vision that Bolivia wants to be a battery producer, not just about extracting lithium. I think there are a number of steps in that process, but you can skip some of them. There's a really impressive startup in Bolivia called Quantum, which is already producing EV cars, smart cars. They've just opened an investment and a plant in Mexico as well. So there's lots of innovation. There's a lot of small companies that are standing on shoulders of giants and just going straight into assembling electronic vehicles. There's a number of steps in the value-added chain that Bolivia can go down. What we're focusing on in terms of our partnership is cathode materials. There's a lot of value in, first, the refining of lithium. There's additional value in producing cathode materials. And then there are a number of different types of batteries that you might be looking to produce. I think each country, based on its own politics and policy making and relationships with communities, will find a different mix. In a place like Bolivia, you have to look at both the natural advantages it has, high concentration of lithium, the world's largest reserves, but also some of the challenges that it will face in terms of capacity constraints. And that's where I think we, and when I say we, I don't just mean the UK, but many other of our like-minded partners can be finding ways of promoting that value added, that ability to rise up the value chain on a kind of patient basis, because you have to walk before you can run. But there are a number of ways in which you can bring community engagement in, and a company like Quantum, which is working very closely with the state-owned lithium company, can do that, and can also help to build public support, because people can see with their own eyes we're producing something here, that jobs are being, high-value jobs are being created, and there are a number of peripheral industries around lithium where local communities can become engaged. It happens to be that the Salar is one of the most spectacular places in the world for tourism, and it's a really underdeveloped sector. And so I think that's something that we can be creative about and really bring a sense of additionality to the work that we do and the alliances that we form.
Juan Carlos, this is a really important point, because when you were minister in Chile, and also you've been in the financial sector and you've been financing these types of projects, et cetera. I mean, there's a difference between a government and a state-owned enterprise essentially determining this is the direction we want to go on the one hand, and on the other hand, creating the enabling environment to allow resources to flow to where they might have the greatest opportunity for success in the marketplace. How do you see the difference there in terms of the likelihood of success and the allocation of resources?
Yeah, I've been, as you said, in both sides, and I work in government because I think governments have an essential role to play in many areas in which they are, irreplaceable. But having said that, I think that states are very bad, usually, are very bad at picking technologies and picking winners. I think governments should, put in place a set of rules that offer an attractive business environment for private companies to compete, to develop and deploy technology, and to see where do they have a competitive advantage to produce, different products. So in Chile, for example, some people argue that since we have a lot of lithium, we should be producing lithium batteries. And I don't think that makes sense. I think I see the aspiration. I would love to see Chile producing batteries. I see the economic benefits of that. I see the political benefits. If people see our country producing batteries, I think that would facilitate the development of lithium mining projects and so on, would create jobs and so on. But lithium batteries, it's 8% of the cost of the battery. And we are a very distant country. We don't have the other 92% of the things that we need to manufacture batteries. So if we were to manufacture batteries, we would have to import 92% of the stuff we need to the end of the world, because that's where we are, to then ship the batteries back to Europe, Asia, and the US, where cars are manufactured. That doesn't make sense. And that's why companies are not manufacturing batteries in Chile. That doesn't mean, though, that we cannot add more value to what we do already. We can gradually build up capacities to go from lithium carbonate to lithium hydroxide, and then maybe cathodes and so on. But I don't think governments should force, companies to manufacture this or that product. That is very inefficient. Capital has opportunity cost, so we could deploy that capital in other industries. So I see the aspiration, but I think we need to be very careful to make sure that we deploy the resources where we have competitive advantages.
Yeah, I was hoping precisely that you would make those points, because I think that is absolutely right. And we've seen example after example over the years of governments with the best of intentions, including in the United States, support projects which at the end of the day turned out to be not the best use of scarce taxpayer resources. And so I think,
if I may add something else, which I think we didn't mention, but I think it's implied in the discussion we're having. And I think Chris at some point mentioned the word diversification. I think that is very important, because when we, especially after the invasion of Ukraine, some people and government officials are trying to push countries into more independence in terms of how do they secure the minerals or the materials they need. And I see that, but minerals are where they are. So instead of moving towards independence, in which each country manufactures everything it needs, I think we need to move into a diversified supply chain that is resilient, but that realizes that the global economy is complicated, intertwined, interrelated. Because if we try to move towards independence, I think that's going to be very efficient, and it will slow down the energy transition, which I think should be our goal to accelerate.
Yeah. Very well said. Thank you. And in some ways, geography is destiny, particularly, as you said, the ends of the earth. I don't know if I would qualify it that way, but that was a nice comment. Marie-Pierre, let's go to you, because we've been talking a lot about adding value. Many people, in terms of the mining supply chains, critical materials, critical minerals, think in terms of the actual mining process. But there's a separate step as well, obviously, that you're very well aware of, the processing stage. And in this context, in Latin America, China's actually seems to be dominating much of that stage of development. I wonder, are there opportunities there for companies or countries to reevaluate how that's being done and do it perhaps in a different way? Or is that just a sector that is dominated now by China and we have to let it go?
No, I think absolutely there's things that will change and are changing. We have projects in South America, in Argentina, for instance, in lithium, and the processing is going to occur on site. So like it's been occurring for copper for decades now on site in South America. So there's a lot of expertise in terms of mineral processing down in South America, and hopefully this is going to translate into critical minerals as well, like in lithium. So these new processes that are more ESG sensitive, that they are taking care of water, they're trying to generate less waste. These processes are all fairly new, less mature, than the traditional way we were extracting lithium using like the big evaporation pond. So if you think about direct lithium extraction, most of the pilot and most of the innovative projects are happening right now in South America. So this is very interesting, very exciting, and hopefully this will lead South America to become like a center of expertise in those kind of processing. And that is very important. So the technology might come from anywhere in the world, but at some point the expertise will be built where it is operated. And people will learn a lot from operating those kind of process. And this expertise will be exportable eventually when those processes become more mature. The other point I'd like to make, and I really like what Juan Carlos said about efficiencies and where it makes sense and where value is created. I think the value change will evolve a lot because of efficiency. And transporting 6% concentrate lithium spodumene across the world might not be the most efficient thing to do. If you can concentrate to lithium carbonate, this is a lot more efficient to export. The same would apply to a lot of other commodities and critical minerals like copper concentrate being exported against like copper anodes, or exporting iron is a good example, even though it's really not yet on the critical mineral list, but steel will be a critical element in the decarbonization of the world. So exporting iron is a lot more efficient than trying to export green electrons, for instance. So there's a lot of those change in the value chain that will happen just because of efficiency. The market will push those change.
Yeah, these are terrific points. Chris Smith referenced partnership, and I think that's key. And maybe not having the end game in mind because we don't know where we're going, but working together to get there in the most efficient and socially acceptable manner possible. I think those are key points. I want to come back to the studio with Carlos Ibargüen. And Carlos, you mentioned the trend. I think that's my word, not yours, but perhaps you would agree with that. The trend of much of the region toward nationalization, toward state-owned enterprises, toward nationalizing the extractive sector. What implications does that have for private sector investment? Does it have any implications? I mean, it's the realities. People have to deal with it one way or the other, but is that something that we should be concerned about, or is it something we should just take note of and move forward?
It's a reality.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that needs to be looked at and analyzed very carefully in terms of how to interact with different models of government. The extractive industry, whether we're talking about minerals or we're talking about hydrocarbons, has a long history of interacting with all types of government systems around the world. During my 20 plus years at Shell, I had the opportunity of working in the Middle East, in Latin America, in Asia. And the fact is that if the resources are located in these locations and you are interested in accessing them, you need to find a way to interact with the type of government that's in front of you. Obviously, there are certain exceptions, and those exceptions need to be put to one side. But I think for the majority of the cases, you need to find a way. So if you're looking at Latin America and you're looking at a trend that is leading governments to sort of take the baton and say, we're going to be the engine of growth of our economy. We are going to drive this with a bigger participation. What does that mean? In my mind, that doesn't mean that the doors are closed. No. In my mind, that means that you need to sit down and really look at these terms and conditions. Ultimately, what will drive a decision of a company is your ability to generate sustainable value, right? In a way that makes your shareholders happy, in a way that makes your stakeholders happy, and in a way that contributes also value to the country where you're operating. If you can tick those boxes, let's say under a nationalist regime, then you go for it, right? You go for it. I think ultimately governments are more than willing and are very permeable to more than willing to sit down with companies and are very permeable to have discussion around, let's say, ESG. How can we make this industry safer, better for our citizens? How can we generate jobs? How can we do this in a way that is good for the environment? These kinds of conversations open doors that will lead companies to places where I think that they want to be, because sometimes the decisions have to do with public policies that involve the taxation, that involve terms and conditions within contracts. So I think it's a conversation that needs to happen. My view is that you can do business with pretty much any form of government, but you need to be quite sophisticated and you need to be quite savvy in terms of how you engage.
Well, you've alluded to it, but let me be more explicit too. That not every state-owned enterprise is the same from country to country. I mean, Chile has had Codelco for years, and it's been a very successful enterprise, et cetera. But there are other models that perhaps haven't worked quite so well in the context from partnership with the private sector. No.
That's exactly right. Each government, each state is very different. Some states I have more experience in managing state-owned enterprises. Others are dabbling in this as of the last couple of years. Others have gone in and out of these models. So yes, you will find a very asymmetrical playing field. But I go back to what the Undersecretary said. If you can open these channels of discussion with governments and you can articulate in a very clear way what you need to generate value and what your value proposition is, I think the chances of reaching a win-win is much larger than dismissing something because of the philosophy behind populism or nationalism. It's at the end of the day, governments can be a lot more pragmatic than one can think.
And we see that in some countries in the region, perhaps at the national level with one approach, and at the provincial or state level, different approaches. Yeah, and we could name names here, and I don't know that we need to, but we have some in mind. And I could name at least 3 countries where that's the case. So thank you, Carlos. What a great intervention. Chris, I want to come back to you. I want to introduce a topic that we have not talked about explicitly yet, but in the private sector, obviously we need to. That's money, financing, right? Where's the financing coming from? The Undersecretary talked about the incredible need globally for critical materials. And in your space, you have them directly and you need them. But, financing is limited in terms of global pools of capital, et cetera. Who's financing these projects? And do you sense that that's a block on further development, or is the money there when you need it?
All right. So that's a big question.
Yeah, it's a huge question. But you can answer it.
Right. So Ford's making an enormous bet in this space. And again, this is an investment in the future of transportation. So it's a $50 billion investment, which is, this is the largest transformation that our company has made in our 120-year history. When you look at, so everywhere I go, we have discussions around kind of this sort of nascent industrial policy that you see in the United States. The Inflation Reduction Act does really make some steps towards incentivizing companies to invest in the United States and pushing demand development. So, the production tax credit that we see in IRA is, it's important. Companies around the world aren't going to replicate that, right? There's going to be different approaches that different countries take. An observation you made earlier around geology. We say, geology is the tyrant, right?
Yeah.
Geology is going to determine what you do where, because either the geology yields what you need or it doesn't. And so, each region of the world is going to have to think about, well, what are the types of incentives that regions need to think about in terms of the need to attract investment in a way that develops and builds value for that country, for that region, for the people of that country. And making that clear, making that explicit, making it purposeful, make it understandable for countries like Ford. That is, as we ramp up to 2 million electric vehicles per year, our need for critical minerals is going to be enormous. Like we're going to need, diversification is going to be very important, but also just the quantity of minerals is going to be very great. So there is capital to support these efforts. And again, this is investment that we're making ourselves. Yep. It's also going to be important for governments to think about, well, how do their domestic policies attract investments in a way that creates value for those countries? And that's easier said than done. It's a hard equation, but we've talked about sustainable value. We talked about competitive advantage. Each of the countries are going to have to think about what is their strategy for participating in this electric revolution. That is, again, it's not the future, like it's happening now. And that's the conversation we're having in every region of the world as we're endeavoring to make sure we got the critical minerals that we need in order to meet like this enormous increase in production that we're seeing and our competitors are seeing as well, right? So this is a wave that is upon us right now.
Yeah. Jeff, let me turn to you, back to the virtual universe there in Bolivia. Bolivia is a country that doesn't attract the type of investment flows that perhaps some of its neighbors do for a variety of reasons. But, the country has large ambitions in terms of development and clean energy, as we've been talking about, as you've been highlighting for us. What happens when the private sector isn't captured by or taken by or interested in some of the opportunities that might exist in a country, and yet the need is still there for development? I mean, this is a leading question, obviously, but let me ask it differently, so as not to put you on the spot. What can people do to change that dynamic, to help the private sector, the folks who want to deploy capital, see the opportunities in a country like Bolivia, so that a country like China doesn't be the only country that sees real opportunity there?
So I think the Bolivian state themselves have invested about $1 billion in lithium, but capital is not always plentiful, and so there will be times when in order for the Bolivian government to reach its aspirations and for the Bolivian people to reach their aspirations, and this is not just true of the country that I'm in, but this is true across many geographies. There will be a need, and I think that necessity is the mother of invention. And you can read into that what you like. I think there are models in Bolivia and around the world where the state has a very clear role, sometimes, and in the case of Bolivia, defined by the Constitution and by legislation. We have to respect the sovereignty of this issue if that is a democratic choice of the Bolivian government to go down that route. If there are ways in which you can find a model whereby the private sector participates, respecting both the sovereignty and the desires of the country, then great. And if there is a way that you can't, then that opportunity will go somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the point of the program where I make my normal intervention about how I would hope that the United States government would deploy more effectively some of the tools we have in the Western Hemisphere, like the DFC, like the MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the Development Finance Corporation, some of these other existing tools that we have that are focused on other regions of the world. But from my perspective, we have opportunities in the Western Hemisphere that can be highlighted and focused on and work with the private sector to develop more effectively. So thanks, Jeff, for that. And I know you're a diplomat and you spoke diplomatically, and we appreciate your comments very much. And in the short time remaining, we have approximately 10 minutes to go. I want to come back to Juan Carlos in the context of Chile. I mean, Chile has traditionally been a country that has attracted its fair share of international investment because of the investment climate, because of the stability that our panelists have been talking about, because of the transparency relatively free from corruption, particularly compared to some of the neighbors, and doing things in a way that international investors have appreciated. Is that model changing? Is that something that we need to take a look at? How should we view these issues?
Yeah, I think it's not changing. But I see that answer could be half realization and half hope. I think this government is a left, leaning government, and I think they are trying to push more government intervention, especially in the lithium industry. I think around copper we have a broad agreement across the political spectrum and with different, stakeholders of where we're going to go on copper. We don't have that agreement on lithium. And I think that is a big problem because these are long-term investments. You need a long, horizons to deploy your projects. And if you see that there is no political agreement on where the country wants to go, it's very difficult for private companies to make a decision. Governments last 4 years, and if we're kind of changing the course of policy around lithium every 4 years, it's very difficult for private companies to invest. And I think we have a challenge there. I don't think we have been able to build that common view of where we're going to go around lithium for many reasons we don't have time to discuss. And I think another issue that we haven't talked about, and it's very important, it has a political angle, it's permitting. So permitting is getting increasingly difficult all over the world, not only in Chile. And I think that has at least two kind of angles to it. One is the state capabilities. What are the processes? How do we train the government officials? And we build up the capacity of the agencies to do that, properly. But then there's another angle, which I think it's more like a political or conceptual angle, which is, I think, the way in which we, historically thought about permitting, I think it's completely obsolete. I think in the old days, we thought about permitting in terms of a kind of a trade-off, and this is a simplification, but a trade-off between, building stuff and economic growth on the one hand, and then taking care of the environment on the other hand. With climate change as a threat, I think that's completely obsolete, because if we want to slow down emissions and navigate a quick energy transition, we need to build a lot of stuff in the energy sector, generation, transmission, mining operations, and so on. So if you slow down those investments, you are hurting the environment, right? Because you are, hampering our capability to deal with climate change. And I don't think we have kind of updated the way in which we think about these trade-offs regarding the energy transition, climate change, and biodiversity. And I think, and unless we do that, it's going to be very difficult to get the permits to build the stuff we need to build.
That's a really interesting point, and you're right, we hadn't raised it. I'm glad you did. And I wish, this is the fault of the moderator who has clearly failed. I wish I would have brought that into the conversation earlier because this is a critically important point, and you've given us a changed paradigm in terms of how to look at some of these issues. Marie-Pierre, I know that these issues are very important to your company, et cetera. And I wonder, just building on that from Juan Carlos, does Rio Tinto look at economies for investment based on how they are and take it kind of as this is the way it is and we need to work within that environment? Or do you also seek to perhaps work with governments to build that capacity, to strengthen that understanding of what some of these issues might be, and to find partnerships all along the supply chain, not just perhaps, in the mining, the specific mining activity, but along the entire supply chain? Or is that not something that a company like yours tends to focus on?
No, I think it's key to get any kind of project moving forward. Yeah. And government obviously are like a super important stakeholders, and engagement with all the stakeholders very early on in the process is key to getting a permit. And embedding that into the permitting process is also very important. So from our perspective, it's not about getting the requirement to get a permit lower in any case, because we need to do mining in a responsible way. So we need to make sure that everything is done properly and the environment and community are protected. So it's not about lowering the bar, but it's about making the bar clear and making the process of the decision making quick and swift and efficient, so we could move forward with those projects. So making the permitting process clearer and efficient is very key to getting those projects moving forward. The other thing that we start to see more and more is that we're trying to do new things that haven't been done before. An example is, for example, extracting critical minerals from waste or legacy tailings, or coupling carbon mineralization with exploitation of critical minerals. And those new processes are not very well defined in the regulation in many instances. So how do you get a permit for carbon mineralization? It's not clear. The process is not very well established almost anywhere, even in the US and in Canada. So how can we move those projects forward? Because those projects, those side projects, could be key enablers to the start of a project for extracting copper or nickel or lithium. If you can couple the nickel project with the carbon mineralization project and make your mine carbon negative, and at the same time, valorize a carbon credit, that can be a very important financial enabler for that process. So making the permitting process clear, transparent, and as efficient as possible without lowering the bar, but also adapting the regulation to new process and new ways to do mining that is coherent with where we want to go with the energy transition and decarbonization is very important.
Transparency, absolutely, in the process is key, and you've pointed to that as have others. Carlos, in the just 2 or 3 minutes we have remaining, you've worked in government in the region. You've also worked for many years in the private sector. Marie-Pierre is talking about some very sophisticated and cutting-edge processes. And again, we don't have time to fully discuss it, but is there capacity in the governments? Can it develop that capacity and the time required to get these investments online in the region? I mean, there's a human capacity element here, isn't there?
Is there capacity right now across Latin America? Probably not. Yeah. At least not to the point where it needs to be. Yeah. Is there a need for institutional strengthening? So, creating very strong, robust regulatory institutions and frameworks. Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head when it comes to one of the big bottlenecks. Yeah. If we can sort out the permitting issue and all the other regulatory issues in a way that allows these projects to be expedited and to be fast-tracked, I think that the region would be in a very, very good place. And this is where the U.S. has, I think, an incredible role to play. I think the U.S. has a lot of experience, as does the U.K. In this area. Probably much more than maybe the Chinese or even the Russian players that are coming in. And I think that you would find a lot of permeability in the region if, projects were offered to help strengthen the institutions, bring public officials to the US or to the UK for training. I think the US brand and the UK brand are very, very strong when it comes to, for example, education and training. And I think more public sector officials would like to come to the US or the UK as opposed to traveling to Beijing or Moscow for training. Those are the kinds of things that I would look for when I'm building my value proposition. Helping them strengthen this area, I think, is absolutely key.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carlos. And Chris, the last word to you. We really only have about 30 seconds, but so use the chance to say a good word about Ford and how you view Latin America and the Caribbean.
Yeah, well, I'd like to build on the last point really quickly. I mean, we've got some muscle memory here in the United States in terms of collaborating with other governments. When I was in the Department of Energy, we had a project where we brought in about 30 mayors throughout Colombia. to the Colombian embassy, and we got to talk to them about our technical projects around reduction of fugitive methane emissions and submitting and casing standards, hydraulic fracturing. So there's we've got, this is an important region for us, and that as our neighbors, we know how to collaborate with the regions, with countries throughout the region, and they're going to be increasingly important as we're thinking about the incredibly large demand for critical minerals. We talked about lithium, but also cobalt and nickel and graphite and manganese. Like, these are all going to be incredibly important for the business model of the future. So forums like this, where we can get together and think about like how do governments and companies collaborate, are incredibly important for us, because we're gonna need all this brain power to help us create the supply chain we need to do the things we need to do.
Well, it's important for us to have you here, and Carlos and the others online. You've really given us a lot to think about. I've learned a lot. I know that all of you watching have also learned a lot. It's been a fascinating conversation that regrettably our time has expired. So we'll call it to a close here, but we will be following and looking at these issues in greater depth going forward as well. And we encourage all of you to continue to join us at the Council of the Americas and to follow our activities, and to give us suggestions and ideas to the extent you want us to follow some issues as well. Thank you again to our panelists, to the Undersecretary of State, and to all of you for joining us here virtually at the Council of the Americas. We look forward to seeing you again very soon for the Council. This is Eric Farnsworth. We will see you next time. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.